Welcome back to Beyond the Algorithm, the podcast. And we have the amazing, the wonderful Al Kingsley MBE with us. Al, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Of course, my full name is Al the Rhythm, but it might be something else.
Amazing. I'm so grateful that you find the time to be here with us, Al, because what we need is we need your experience, we need your drive for the future, but we also need your humor and your approachability because AI can be really quite a stuffy and a little bit of a fearful kind of thing sometimes. And you're either in of the group or you're out of the group. And what we need is we need an avenue for people. So welcome. Do you want to
Thank
tell
you
us a
so
little
much.
bit about yourself?
Wow. Well, firstly, it's lovely to be here, and I am with you. There is a challenge over the last 30 years in all sorts of strands of educational technology, of which AI just pops in as part of that conversation at the end. There is a narrative sometimes to tell people how smart you are by using lots of big words and the complexities of digital, whereas actually the best way is to just break it down into a conversation and recognize it's something for everyone. And that's what I do try and do. So in terms of my journey, I'm somebody who's really bad at saying no. That's the best way of explaining it. So whilst I do have 35 years experience as an EdTech CEO, creating all sorts of cool solutions, both in the education and in the corporate space, I've also spent most of my life doing the stuff that I really care about, which is enabling and supporting the education system. So chair of a multi-academy trust. For the last 5 years, I've chaired our regional SEND board. I sit on the regional school directors advisory board for the East England for the last 5 years. I think I've chaired, I don't know how many different schools and trusts along that journey. I also chair the BISA EdTech group, British Education Suppliers Association, as well as roles supporting startups and scale-ups and training and supporting school systems here and overseas around the world, just on the journey, typically around change, transformation, mostly digital. Sometimes it's about people, as you know, that's the real catalyst. So I'm kind of half in the digital world, half in the education world. And so I probably can feel the pains from both sides. But we know, as this conversation may well flow, that at the heart of all good stuff is co-production. So I'm in the noisy bit in the middle.
No, but that's the best place to be, though, and it's the most important place to be because it's such a huge field and everybody comes at it from a very, very different angle. Teachers, parents, students, the government, and everybody has a very different perspective. They have different needs and wants, they have different hopes and fears. And in the middle, you're like that conduit brokering those conversations. So fair play to you.
I try to be. I mean, I think, I also try and say it as it is, and people know that I always try and say things with best intent rather than judgment. I think in all camps, there's a little bit of we're all need to reflect and be a bit guilty of imposing imposter syndrome on anybody else. You can't possibly have an opinion because you didn't do this. You're not a teacher, you're not a technologist, you're not. And there's so many different camps and roles, and yet ultimately, when we all sit down over a coffee and it's a much more relaxed setting, a non-challenging setting, what we realize is some of these biggest problems are never going to be fixed by one perspective. They're always going to be the collaboration of much. I can say it today. We're having this conversation. The new F1 season's about to kick off for those who are interested in motorsport. Can you imagine if the race car that they launched for this season was developed just by the drivers, or just by the marketing team, or just by the engineers? It would either go fast and straight off at the first corner, or it would look super shiny and not move at all, or it'd have really comfy seats and a cup holder, but not be very aerodynamic. The point is, in my very clumsy analogy, why wouldn't we want to have those different perspectives around the table when we grapple with big topics, not least with AI, which encroaches on every facet of our lives?
Yeah. So, for those of us in the audience who are novices, can you just tell us where are the government right now in regards to their view on AI and just kind of just update us as to where they're at currently?
Well, I mean, again, I think the answer is there's a will, but we're behind the curve. We're well behind the curve compared to other countries. So there is some support and funding coming out for basic training. Some of you will have seen the kind of resources that have been shared with Chartered College, resources have been shared with Chiltern and others did to fund sort of basic. In terms of policy, there's still work grappling with how do we move through policy. We see some bits in terms of expectations on that to show where, if they are using AI, evidence of how it's being used. We see it rippling into Kingsley, and we get guidance about making sure when it comes to keeping our learners safe. We've got filtering and monitoring, identifying where AI tools are used. We've got guidance coming out of government to AI manufacturers, developers, putting the onus on them to have visibility and transparency in how AI is wrapped within their products.
Mm.
And that term that seems to be the one that features on every other conversation, and identifiable, where we get cognitive offloading. Again, that sounds cool. Now I've said that means I must understand everything. But
Absolutely.
it's like all these things, we get these different messages woven into different bits.
Yes.
But when we look for the cohesion at the center, it's not quite yet there yet. And I think the bigger problem is, because we work behind the curve, education, particularly government, which is just like double down on the slowdown, looks for evidence-informed based decision making, and then looks for policy and political decision making. We tend to see something happen and we react to it. And because we react in quite a slow way, we're always looking at ways to prevent and stop and block
Yes.
and keep safe, rather than looking with a balance to that, to also how can we embrace and amplify and support and develop. And of course, what we want with any technology is we want both, don't we? We want to unlock potential. We want to unlock capacity to do things. But at the same time, we also want to be really cautious about the risks to our learners.
Yeah.
Interestingly, from a political point of view, some of our messaging is we need to be really, really careful, and this stuff has lots of risks and potential harm. And we conflate AI with the current social media challenges, frankly. And
Yes.
then at the same time, when it's convenient, we have a government saying, actually, if our staff use AI, that will release and reduce loads of their workload pressures. So quit your moaning, and you don't need any more funds and capital support.
Well,
you
yeah.
know, and so we could go on forever, because I could say, well, 5 years ago there was a pandemic and we got all these great devices to use in our schools, which would include being able to use for technology for learning's sake, and they're all due for renewal and refresh now, but we don't have any change to our capital funding. So we're going to go from schools that were a bit device richer than they have been to ones that are going to have gaps in their provision, and we're going to be taking a step back anyway. So there we are.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because the problem with education is that it has so many stakeholders, but the great thing about education is it has so many stakeholders. And so
And
what
yeah.
what what we've got is the fact that the curriculum and assessment has always been the last bastion to move, and we're stuck in these very traditional methodologies. And so when you look at AI and the impact that AI has on education, actually you need everybody to be moving at roughly the same pace. You've got curriculum
Mm.
bodies, assessment bodies, government bodies.
Let me just dip in on the assessment bodies. I was very lucky, and I don't think they'll mind me sharing here. I was very lucky to be invited back end of last year to speak at the British Council's assessment conference, to do their plenary at the end of the day to provide a bit of challenge. And so they had many of the assessment boards there. Um, and I shared a panel where I just identified that when it came to all the changes we've seen in terms of assessment methodologies by the big exam boards,
Mm,
almost without exception, all of those changes were based around legal reasonable adjustments that were needed for learners.
yeah,
None were around how technology could be used to close the
yeah,
loop.
agreed.
Now, bear in mind, I'm not suggesting in any way technology is the panacea to anything, but what I do look at is, and maybe if we just zoomed out one step, one would be each of my secondary schools spends about £160,000 a year on exam fees. I actually believe that my teacher and centre assessed grades were more reflective of my learners than the ones that went on the high stakes tests externally. But if I could have those exam boards more effectively capturing learning quickly and digitally, maybe I could reduce that money. And if I put 150 grand back into every secondary school in the country, maybe I'd mitigate a bigger national problem about the funding we've got in education and where it's going. Now,
Mm,
that's not just a political point, it comes onto the whole assessment idea. And again, I'm very mindful that sometimes I'll say it as it is, and I won't always get all the Christmas cards, and so be it.
it,
But
it
but
is.
I raised the question, we're worried about AI, we're worried about assessment, aren't
Mm,
we? And how does that look like in this landscape? And I'm like, so our most senior qualification you can probably get on your academic journey will be, congratulations, you're Dr. Al. You've completed your thesis.
Suit.
Imagine that. It's not going to happen for a while, I can assure you, if ever. Um, but the point is, how would I get my doctorate? I would sit down in a Viva and have a panel of folks who would
Yeah.
question and challenge me on my knowledge. And we'd recognize that's the only way to really make sure I've got an in-depth knowledge on something solid. And And when I go back to my master's, I have a combination of those kind of conversations plus written assessments plus research. And I work my way back. And when I get to my GCSEs and A levels, we go, no, 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 no. You just need to
Yeah.
remember it and you've got one chance. But worse than that, and I was challenged on it and I pushed back and say, I disagree. Um, I'm quite proud of my 5 meter swimming badge. I like to set the bar quite low in terms of where what I achieved at school, but it's a good starting point. But imagine for GCSEs, what we actually do is we get all of our students to take the GCSEs, and when the results are in, we then decide what is the pass rate and where we'll cross the line. Imagine my 5 meter swimming badge if we started by saying you start swimming when you're halfway across. To make it a valid test, at least 30% of you have got to drown. Otherwise, it would be unreflective of our swimming cohort. But in essence, that's what happens with our GCSEs. Every year, that benchmark gets put in the sand. Why couldn't all of our children do well this year and have a 100% pass rate? Because that wouldn't be reflective of consistency in our exams. So I put the challenge that I think part of the challenge here is we've got a system that doesn't want to change because there's both revenue involved with that. And the
Yes.
best way to have credibility, the best credibility of a test is that somebody fails it. That means it's got some rigor and robustness to it.
Yeah.
And on our focus to do that, we don't want to embrace technology. Governments are also nervous. I'll share another little one on a little extended detour. I was talking, saying, well, we've got digital skills. Why don't we have more digital tests in our schools? But one big issue, we don't have enough technology, devices in hands consistently in our schools to
Hmm.
do that. But when I asked the question, the British Council have been doing trials of this on devices in Japan. So they've been researching and doing tablets being delivered by trucks around to different schools for exams and capturing evidence of the impact successfully of digital examinations. So as a great nation, we're doing quite a lot of background research, just not necessarily in our own patch. So I would encourage that sense of let's just recognize there's some invested voices here.
Yes.
Just in saying, when you and I talk about AI Dawn, most of the central meetings start with Microsoft, Google, Amazon sat in the room. Those foxes guarding the chickens. And as we're recording this, only today, government have announced about how Microsoft have been signed up for an AI training campaign and support across the system. Well, I'm sure that's great. And I've got no axe to grind with Microsoft, Google, et al. But I do think we need to be mindful that that's done because they want us to be committed and invested
Yeah.
on their platforms and technologies, both within our system and when we leave that system.
And I think the challenge with tech and assessment is that there is both a commercial interest and then there is also a financial interest from the government as well. And therein lies sort of one of the biggest challenges that we have. And you're right in your sort of conversation in regards to when we go to university, some great changes are being made, the scope, the space, the changes are being made. But with my kids, they did the mock exam and they came out the mock exam and I said to them, "How you feeling?" My hand hurts. Because
Yeah.
ultimately we want to get them used to using tech, using software, using tools, however you want to frame it, in a way that they will do moving forward in life. But then all of a sudden we go, now slow your roll. Learn this and get into an exam and write down this. I'm not suggesting that we haven't made progress in terms of demonstrating higher order thinking skills, cognitive dimensions, etc. I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just suggesting that we need to, like I said, maybe, we can get some
Inclusivity,
computers
isn't it?
here.
It's breadth of provision for different learning styles. I mean, people often think when I talk about digital and AI that
Mm,
it's a zero-sum game. It's that or the traditional curriculum, without remembering that the core tools you need to utilize a large language model and an AI tool effectively
mm,
are literacy and oracy. You need to
yeah,
be able to speak and type and engage and ask the right questions and iterate and all the things that go with it.
yeah,
So this isn't about that because it's about supporting that foundation.
yeah.
But if I flip my hat to, as I have on a number of occasions, chairing alternative provision through a
Mm,
journey, I can promise you, if I sit down with those learners and say, we want you to capture on a piece of paper all the things you know about a subject, after 10 to 15 minutes, there will be distraction, there will be discouragement, there will be a drop off in activity. If I ask to sit and just talk to me and I capture digitally and audibly what they know on a subject, they will
mm,
share far greater depth of their knowledge. If I turn it into something that's project based learning, convert what you know into music or into a game or other aspects, if it's seen to be a different way that actually stimulates, and more importantly, for the first time, for some of our learners, seems to have purpose, then suddenly we're giving them skills and purpose, and we're talking more about agency than we are anything else. And yet we have these digital tools, and yet we almost feel like somehow it's a bypass or a cheat. Well, I would argue the individual, the human being, the educator uses their professional judgment of how to use these tools at the right time to capture evidence of a child's learning journey. And it will be a different combination for different learners.
Yeah.
Much as we'd say, our school system's fab for 70% of learners who go to school. For the other 30%, it really just is the wrong square peg in a round hole. We can either keep saying, well, they'll just have to keep trying to accommodate and squeeze, or we're going to have to start being more, making it more relevant, more accessible to our learners, which is why 25% of kids currently in England are not in school or traditional school setting.
Yeah.
Let me share a Chinese proverb. It feels very appropriate in a conversation about digital and AI, he says with a slight smile on his face.
Yeah.
A stumbling bird can reach the forest first. Chinese proverb, which basically relates to the mindset that historically, and I exaggerate for effect, folks, in the West, we are pre-programmed to the assumption that the most academically strong child will be the most successful in school and the most successful there in life.
Yeah.
And in the East, pre-programmed that the child that works hardest, puts the extra lessons and tutoring in, the extra study will be the one. So in other words, that stumbling bird can get up early, work a bit harder, and still achieve and be first to the forest. Why is that important? Well, AI has amplified that the workplace is already now using technology that can count faster than the best mathematicians, can translate faster than the best linguists. So employers are saying, actually, what I like are those soft skills or power skills. I want to know about your communication skills, your critical thinking skills, your resilience, your imagination, your creativity. If the workplace has suddenly put greater value on their human skills because the digital world is taking on the more, shall we call it, academic streams, then we've just flipped that model that says actually the most successful kids won't necessarily be the ones with the most GCSEs and A levels. They'll be the ones with the most human skills that will complement what the workplace needs.
Yeah.
And if we learn that, then suddenly we say, you know what, this academic system from 1870, where universities decided to create a filter and a front door, and we created this framework of our qualifications, will shift. Because right now, you and I, if we wanted to look at a shift in our career, we would probably think about going online, signing up for a digital course and doing a micro credential. We'd study it for a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. We'd get a digital certificate, and depending on our role, we'd either get a different job or an employer would give us a promotion and a pay rise. So in that sense, the most important qualifications are the ones that are current and relevant and subject-based. The foundational ones are about door openers. Now, I don't want to say one should exist without the other, but I think we need to be really mindful of stop getting on our high horses and thinking we have to protect the existence and the consistency of our GCSEs and A levels, because wakey, the curriculum review at the moment for most subjects is a good nibble around the edges. It is not a transformation. We're always talking about, like at the moment, there's a review on computing. Well, we need to talk about AI and other aspects, but what can we lose? We don't want to lose anything. Well, hello. Do you think, I mean, does anyone want to look at what's happening in the world with computer coding and vibe coding and technology? There are some foundational things that we need to skip and get to the much more important things about how do we unlock understanding. Again, critical thinking is more important than evidence of tool handling. That's where we kind of miss the point. So, and there'll be others that will challenge me, and that's cool too, because I think what we need is different perspectives, and as always, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But the pace of change is such that our curriculum reform is just not able to react and respond.
And see, but because it comes from an outdated system, because what we had was you would learn a skill and that skill would see you through your whole life, jobs for life, and
One
that
job,
was
yeah,
that.
absolutely. Yeah.
And now it's completely different, you see, because those skills, they are being turned over, just in time learning, where you're learning as you progress through your career. And you have lots of little branch offs as you kind of specialize and then go and re-specialize in something else. And learning is ubiquitous. There are no gatekeepers anymore. Technology and access to it is the only gatekeeper now. The teacher is no longer the central hub.
Well, I think it's a bit of a mindset, isn't there? I think historically there's almost a sense of if you start your career and you decide to do something else, you've failed, as
Mm,
opposed to recognizing that actually
yeah,
what, I call it, we used to call it lifelong learning. I call it lifelong curiosity, because I think it's the curiosity to want to discover new jobs, to do things that fulfill you, that challenge you. And often the reason we change jobs is because we're not feeling stretched and challenged, and that's
mm,
okay too. But if we change our mindset to it's successful if you jump careers and you move
of course
about and
it
you
is. Yeah,
develop new things, then we also change the idea that what we're trying to acquire is a toolbox of both qualifications that prove our knowledge
yeah,
and certificates that evidence our skill, and that then unlocks what we do. I mean, there's a good argument, and we've got some amazing primary schools and infant schools within our map that I love dearly. But there is an argument that we kind of systematically remove curiosity out of our learners
yeah.
by the time they get to about 5 or 6. Now, I'm going to caveat that with our infant school is a place that just inspires creativity and imagination. And it's a place where you just get that feel when you walk in the door. So it's not a definitive thing. And it's not the human beings that are the issue. It's the system that requires more and more narrowing and conformity rather
Yeah.
than that. Let's allow that free form play and creativity to lead the learning journey for much, much longer. Please. Thank you very much.
And there is that narrowing though, and I think that the skills such as resilience, such as the ability to be able to understand that we need to constantly be evolving, changing, building relationships and understanding, like learning to learn is one of the most important things. That's what changed the game for me. Up until 20 years old, I had no academic qualifications whatsoever. And then when somebody pointed out that I was dyslexic, then I went on a journey of learning cognitive skills and actually how we learned. And now with AI, there doesn't need to be any barriers. The only barrier is the system itself. And if we can develop resilience, if we can teach people how we learn, if we can show people, that tenacity and drive and focus can get you forward, but you just need to understand what's happening here.
I mean, we have to think of AI particularly as something that is an awfully good, potentially, enabler to access to information and equity for many learners
Yeah.
around the world. But there is a bit of a but with it. I mean, we know all the obvious stuff, don't we? We've got to make sure that actually part of that digital citizenship journey, that digital skill set is
Yeah.
understanding about authenticity and bias and risk and harm.
Mm.
Um, but I think if we go back a step, and I always like to try and zoom out in terms of a conversation, if you were foolish enough to say, Al, I'm giving you the power of God for a day to recreate the education system on the planet,
Ah.
and many listening now would be panicking for sure. Um, I wouldn't start with bricks and mortars anyway. The first thing I would do is put a device in the hand of every child,
Yep.
so wherever they were in the world, they would get equitable education. Much
Exactly.
like cigar-to-meter proof with the hole in the wall experiment, it's about give them the tools and they will come. I think that's probably a crossover for some film about baseball
Sounds
players,
good
but
though.
nonetheless, but nonetheless, but you don't stop there. You don't say, well, because of the geography, clearly children in sub-Saharan Africa can't all walk to
Yeah.
a high-quality school, so you have to put a device and connectivity in their hand. Step two is you then build places and spaces to bring them together, because
Yeah.
I do believe the most valuable thing our children get from being in school is a sense of place and purpose,
Yeah.
a sense of pride, a sense of building friendships, developing their relationships and so on. But you can't physically do that everywhere. And people say, you can't have remote education, though. It doesn't work out. And you know what? They've been doing that in Australia over the radio for decades, and it worked
Yeah.
quite well. I sit on the advisory board of Minerva Education, virtual school here in the UK that supports elite athletes and also children that would otherwise be transferred by a local authority many miles every morning to a school out of region, and instead they can now access high quality education. Again, think of that 30/70 education
Mm.
fits for some, but not for others. But then that bit about, well, you've got a device in the hand, you've got a place in space. The bit that really unlocks is not that AI, that technology allows us to enter a much more up-to-date world of perhaps I would have had when I was starting out, which was looking and saying, aren't I lucky I've got Encyclopedia Britannica available to me that my peers don't have.
Nothing wrong
But
with the
it's the skills.
encyclopedia.
No, it isn't. But you know what? When we talk about equity in education, it's always been a challenge of some had
Oh, yeah,
encyclopedias,
yeah,
some didn't. Some had access to Lycos and Alta Vista, and some didn't.
yeah.
Now we have access to large language models. But the bit unlocks is not just the cable and connectivity. It is understanding the skills to use that in a
Yeah,
place that takes you in a positive journey versus detours you into where we see suddenly that we think the tool that we're engaging with is suddenly anthropomorphized and it's alive and it cares about me, but quite the opposite, it's also
it's me.
telling me in a negative way to go different things. And so we can't have it's a bit like data in our schools. It needs to be data informed, not data led decision making. And I think the same is with large language models, is there's huge potential when it's safeguarded, when it's ring fenced, and we develop first the confidence and skill sets for staff to use, but also have the right conversations with learners and learners to understand where it adds value and where it absolutely
Yeah,
is taking away their ability to think and challenge. And I guess in learning, the number one thing we always say is the place where we learn most is when we're at the bottom of that curve in the struggle. You know, when we
yeah,
have the struggle and the grip on a challenge, when we resolve it, there's also a sense of yes, but we develop and we remember it.
yeah,
So, you know, it is back to it's about skills and about training and about understanding as much as it is about the actual tool. And so when there's a big conversation about ed tech and digital tools in schools and the pros and the cons and the yin and the yang, and we could certainly go off on thing on that, in 90% of cases, it's not the tech. I mean, there's some good tech, there's some bad tech, yes. But often it is the human beings and more importantly, the application, the digital strategies to why are we using this tool
yeah,
as opposed to what tool have we got and how we're going to use it. The why is so important and we often miss that. So we've got loads of tools that don't get used properly, don't get used at the right time, or were never needed in the first place. That's for sure. But it's not the tool at fault. It was the decision-making process and the subsequent application.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm just still so passionate though about the idea that students need to be taught the fact that the brain is able to build new neural, networks and actually
Not sure
just
mine is,
be
but I'm with you.
And the fact of the matter is just because in this context and in this, sort of scenario, just because you are not thriving doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. In other situations, and what happens is sometimes students get their heads down and they never come back up again,
Mm.
and in particular for us who are neurodiverse, there is a lot of fear, there's a lot of shame, that comes alongside that. And I'm speaking about generative AI in a conversation at the Schools and Academies show. And I believe that AI, if utilized correctly, if students are taught the right skills and supported in the right way, AI is going to have a huge impact on leveling the playing field for us neurodiverse, for sure.
Oh, I'm gonna put it out there a bit further. If we exaggerate the conversation around digital tools being used in the workplace to mitigate many of those more complex, more procedural, more data-driven tasks, I think our soft skills become our power skills,
Yeah,
and many of our neurodiverse learners become the future education power rangers. They become the ones that we're actually singling out because you think differently to the
yeah,
algorithm. You think
yeah,
differently to the problem solving. You think differently to the way that you might communicate and interact with other people. In the same way as we will all respect the fact of noticing the other way around. Oh, that website, they've got a human being that talks to you when you've got a problem. That website is written in a
no,
different way. You can see, and there's a place and a space, isn't there?
yeah,
Because much like education, there's an assumption for some based out of fear and justifiably so that technology replaces the educator, technology replaces the
mhm,
teaching assistant, and suddenly our learners become fed and dealt. It's the old sage on the stage to guide on the side, but how far on the side is the guide?
yeah,
But in reality, the objective is using technology to where are purposeful, evidence informed, to unlock time and capacity so there is more human to human interaction.
yeah,
Because much as people don't like to admit it, courtesy of policy, and if in doubt, schools will deal with it, there is more focus on staff on SEMH and attendance and the broader well-being
Yeah.
there is necessarily on delivering Pythagoras's theory. And we need to kind of just recognize that.
God love Pythagoras and his theory.
I've used it a lot since. I always question whether I've used matrices since I left school. Quite a lot of algebra and other bits and pieces. I did do some examples at an AI session I was doing with the neurodiverse team that was formerly the Autistic Education Trust, where I was just talking about examples, and I thought I'm going to do some history here. So I did Battle of Hastings, and I remembered Bay of Tapestry, and I got quite proud about that. So my next one's going
Harold
to
and his
be
eye.
Expo Lakes, I think is my next topic, just to make sure I can show. We jest about it, you know what? And some of my favorite moments I remember from school, like we all say, are people, not
Yeah.
the things. Um, but it does reflect back on that comfort we get in consistency of our curriculum really undervalues and under recognizes the fact that it isn't about keeping those traditional topics and conversations.
Yeah.
We've moved to a world, I mean, education thrives in a knowledge sparse setting.
Yeah.
But when we're in a knowledge rich setting, as we are now, courtesy of AI and online search engines and resources, education has to change because it ceases to have a purpose. If all
Yeah.
you're going to give me is facts, I can get them elsewhere. What agency comes from is facts plus context and skills. And
Yes.
so we need education to move to context and skills. That doesn't mean you don't share facts because they're part of the story of creating the context. But we're so focused on that, we need to shift across and recognize big curriculum changes is about context and skills. Because I promise you, it won't be very long, if not within the next year or two, where most of us, when we want something, we don't look up in a book. We just speak to a headset, we speak to our phone. It gives us the information we want. And the idea that that's the important stuff is not. The important stuff is what do I do with that knowledge and how do I know if it's correct? What does it
Yeah.
unlock for me?
And
Um,
there's a lot of issues with that, isn't there? Because, I do a lot of work speaking about how knowledge has to be protected. And actually, that there is hallucinations in AI.
there
There
is.
is, there is a huge amount of incorrect information out there. And knowledge at source has to be protected at all counts, because the second that information becomes corrupt and biased, then education itself is rotten at the core. Because
Although
where are you coming from?
I'm going to push back because the last time I checked, allegedly, I've written one more book than I've actually written, courtesy of AI. So I think I'll take that as a win. So sometimes it can help. I'm taking this tongue in cheek for folks
I know,
listening.
I know.
I mean, I love the work of people like Victoria Headland, the AI bias
Yes,
girl.
absolutely.
A great prompt on the end of anything you get as an output is what steps did you take to mitigate
Yeah.
bias in your output? And we've had backwards and forwards. Show me top 10 footballers in England in the last 10 years, and it comes
Mm.
up with all men. But I seem to remember all of the medals and trophies being won by ladies, and we use that as a very clumsy thing. There is improvements. But if we think again, my bigger picture zoom out I like to do, I was doing a conference in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, and they were basically saying 8% of the world speak Arabic, but only 3% of the internet's in Arabic. So we get an underrepresentation
Yeah,
of cultural
absolutely.
values and norms. I was doing a project, I met up with the lovely Sandy Toksvig in the University Centre in Peterborough.
Down at 72.
She's doing the Mappamundi project, which is going back over 200 years to digitize the evidence of inventions and discoveries by women
Wow.
around the world, because
Amazing.
historically they weren't allowed to be attributed to them. But if you don't digitize it and you don't put it into the learning
Exactly.
journey, then we have young women in schools thinking that actually there's not much expectation that they'll be the ones that are the inventors and discoverers of the future. So there is lots of really cool stuff happening behind the scenes to say we know there's deficiencies.
Yeah.
How do we make sure we proactively swing that back?
Yeah, and that's got to be an absolute priority, because, like I said, once that knowledge base becomes biased and corrupt, it becomes factually inaccurate. Then, if it is the source, the font of alleged knowledge, then all of a sudden we've got a huge problem. And we had Victoria on the podcast, and it was great, to hear that people are talking about that. And it is by a series of prompts that you can actually work out, is it factual? Give me the link that you got that from.
Yeah.
Tell me the source. Show me the accuracy rate.
Here's one challenge, Dawn, just to throw out towards the end of our chat. Whenever I talk to schools and we're talking about AI and data, the first conversation we have is we don't want to share our data. We want to protect any information. We don't want it to upload. And then the critique I hear is, yeah, the output isn't always accurate and it doesn't really reflect our cohort. Have we ever stopped and thought we don't want to share our cohort-based information, anonymous, of course, but we also then complain when the output isn't reflective of us. And it's like, well, there's a chicken and egg here, isn't there?
Yeah.
We see trusts sharing their data, going from data pools to data lakes, because then we can weed out outliers and get much more accuracy. But maybe as society moves on, what we should be doing is having educational establishments sharing our data with a government large language model training base that allows it to be trained on that data. So it is reflective of English schools and it is reflective of
Hallelujah.
our inliers and outliers, and it is ring fenced in terms of how that data can be used. So in the same way as we say nobody selling technology into education should be allowed to sell the data onwards in any direction, maybe we could join together and think, because we would get much better data if we actually felt comfortable sharing
Yeah.
where the data is cohort. It's a little bit like we do in a different way with our pixel results. You know, we all share them and we get a much better sense of where we're at during the
Yeah.
year. Same kind of concept.
Beautiful. So we're coming to the end of the podcast and we could talk forever and ever and ever, but you're a very busy man and we're so grateful of your time. But before you go, can you please tell us all about the Institute of AI Education, please?
Oh, I would love to. And thank you for asking that question. So we attended there's a fab event up alongside York St John's University
Yeah,
at the dynamic duo, as I refer to them, Narinder Gill and Dr. Beth Lane,
absolutely.
had this great idea about bringing together proper research about the practical use of AI in teaching, starting at the various earliest years. And that involved how do we support and fund research, PhD research, so that we actually create something in a model that can be shared out to other universities, other research centers, and can be something that's free and accessible to all. So naturally, creating the Institute, we created an advisory board. I chair the advisory board. I wanted to bring in voices from different sectors. We want to make sure that we've got that real mix and diversity. And then we're already, courtesy of support from the university, St John's University in York, funding a first postgraduate student who is doing research that will feed back, working with lots of stakeholders. So we're hoping there'll be lots of other research and lots of other PhD work going on in parallel. The most important thing about all of this is about co-production. It's about not being there to say what people should do. It's being there to learn. You'll know from the very first event, my first session, I spent an hour asking questions. I
Yeah.
could have spent an hour talking and musing of all my thoughts, but what we want to do is continuously learn and adapt. It's something I would really encourage folks to keep an eye on, connect with on LinkedIn, head over to if you search for Institute of AI Education, you'll find the website. But it's something where I think there's going to be some really exciting project work working with other stakeholders. But the most important thing is it's not sometimes people use the term club, you know, it's a club with an open door. That's
Yeah,
the most important
love
thing. It's
that.
about its richness is the breadth of membership, and membership in the sense of no one's got a badge. We're just a community that want to do the right thing and recognize those values. At the heart of it, Narinder and Beth have a really, really clear vision of what they set out to do. Myself and the advisory board's role is to support them on that, to do the usual things, which is to provide the right support and nurture, and at the right times to challenge the check and balance. Are we doing the right things? And then look across the country. And the last bit I'll add is it's fantastic because it's a northern focus right now, and I think it's really important. We don't always have the same voices in our conversations, so that's another win for me as part of that conversation.
Absolutely. Al, you are absolutely lovely. Thank you so
Bless you, thank you.
much for everything that you're doing for schools, for the kids, just for being who you are. I'm so grateful for you coming
I'm
on the
very lucky
podcast.
that I'm able to do what I do, so I consider that genuinely a blessing. And we all know there are challenges, there are pressures, but in education, aren't we lucky that just the fact
We
there are
really
so
are.
many folks who are willing to help, support, nurture, and just be kind.
Oh my gosh. So on that note, shall we say goodbye to everybody in the audience? We're going to leave Al's links, all the details below. So until then, we will see you in the next episode. Bye, everybody. Oh,